Welcome to this episode of Athletic Training Chat. We have repeat guest on, Justin Young, who is at Indiana State University, actually going back for his PhD, so he's working through his coursework there. But in that process, they recently put out, I believe at the time of the recording was a pre-draft, which we'll have linked up, to a paper called Psychological Ownership in Athletic Training. Really interesting concept, and what they found was really interesting, and just where athletic trainers find themselves with psychological ownership in regards to their profession and their employer and what that means. And so reached out to Justin immediately and wanted to get this recorded just because it is such a unique area, and something I think in terms of the profession, kind of going into the psychological aspect, is going to be really interesting in the years to come. So please enjoy that. As always, we are powered by Mueller Sports Medicine. Please check them out for any of your athletic training needs. We thank them again for teaming up with us on the Throw a Lifeline program. We are still working on getting number 2 fulfilled. We got our first one out, and that is being put to use. So if that is something you'd be interested in helping us out with, check out athletictrainingchat.com/throw a lifeline for more information and a place to donate. But without further ado, please enjoy this episode. Episode of Athletic Training Chat, we are on with repeat guest Justin Young. He was a previous guest on episode 82 on tactical athlete care, which I also picked his brain a lot about there. And now just picking his brain again, as he has a paper that is in pre-publication as of this recording, I believe, but coming out in the Journal of Athletic Training. Justin finished his DAT at Indiana State and now has decided to go back for his PhD, so we'll let him fill in on that decision. I'd be very curious how you write all that on the back, Dr. Young. But with that, we're just going to talk about this paper, this psychological ownership in athletic training. I read it. It was really interesting in terms of job versus profession. I thought that had some really unique insight based on the people that responded. So we're going to have Justin elaborate on that. But before I keep rambling, going for a PhD now.
Yeah, that is the case. So that decision came from this kind of need I felt after finishing the DAT. And I took a long look at some of my long-term aspirations, and really what I like the most about being an athletic trainer. And what I came up with was this idea of I like sharing with other people, and I like sharing information. So I was presented with this opportunity to pursue a PhD here at Indiana State in curriculum and instruction. And I think as of this recording, the way I'd like to combine those 2 degrees is to really encourage and promote professional development in athletic trainers outside of the traditional education setting. So I think we do a really good job educating ATs through that kind of post-professional degree programming or residency programming or things of that nature. But I'd like to really take some of the fundamentals that I've learned throughout my DAT education related to practice advancement and structure that with some strong curricular design and instructional design, and kind of partner with organizations to promote kind of that professional development in a very clinical manner. So that's where that idea came from, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to work towards in the long term.
That sounds awesome. So just in this PhD role, are you teaching / doing some stuff at Indiana State while pursuing?
Yeah, so I work within the doctorate in athletic training here at Indiana State. So just couldn't get enough of it. I had to come back. But yeah, so in my current role, I do some administrative work for the DAT itself. I mentor in some of the research projects. I do some of my own research projects. And then I also do a little bit of teaching within the DAT itself, and then within our applied medicine and rehabilitation department as a whole, kind of assisting with some undergraduate classes there as well.
Awesome. Sounds like you're staying plenty busy. Not that I would have assumed otherwise. So this paper and just really even the concept of psychological ownership, maybe let's start there. If you could define what that is, and then we'll talk about how it specifically applies to the profession.
Sure. So I'm going to start with where I kind of, where this idea generated. So before we got on, we were talking about some books that we had read. And where this idea came from was actually a book by Jocko Willink, Extreme Ownership, which has made the rounds of late. It's a pretty popular book. So I had this idea of ownership and what that meant, kind of ingrained, and really wanted to look at what that meant in athletic training. Now, if you've read the book, the way that ownership is described in that book is more about action, how to be actionable in owning things, as opposed to what we're going to talk about today, which is more feelings. So psychological ownership, or the idea that we researched in this paper, is a feeling that an individual gets over a target. And the word target is really loosely defined. It can essentially be anything. So anything can be a target. It can be physical or immaterial. But the idea is that you feel control or responsibility over that thing. So that being said, there's been a couple different groups of people that have looked at it over time. Most people have looked at it in relation to organizations or jobs and how people feel ownership over those things. But one group a few years ago, I think it was like 2009 to 12-ish, somewhere in there, led by James Avey, broke down psychological ownership into some more defined dimensions. So they looked at self-efficacy, self-identity, belongingness, accountability, and territoriality. And they determined that those 5 things together kind of composed what psychological ownership is, and how people develop that control or that feeling of control over something else. So that's kind of an overview of what the concept is.
Okay.
Is there anything that you feel like you still need some clarity on related to that idea?
No, I think that did a good job of summarizing it. And then I think kind of getting into your paper, that's kind of the unique angle. It's never been done in athletic trainers, at least as far as you had referenced. But then you seemingly took it a step further, and I think you use kind of organization versus / I guess not verse necessarily, profession, and made a couple interesting connections as well.
Yeah. So we looked at the difference between organization and profession. And like I just mentioned, organization is something that had been measured quite a bit in relation to the construct. And what was consistently found was that people with higher psychological ownership demonstrate higher levels of certain work behaviors that are positive. So they have higher job satisfaction. They have higher organizational commitment. They have better or improved knowledge sharing. They've also demonstrated things like perseverance. So we had this idea that higher organizational psychological ownership leads to these positive work-related behaviors. But through some discussions with some peers and some mentors and some colleagues, we decided to also add the aspect of profession in. And the reason for that is, anecdotally, whenever somebody who is an athletic trainer introduces themselves, they usually say, "Hi, my name is blank. I'm an athletic trainer for blank." Mm-hmm. Right? So the profession is always the first thing they identify with, as opposed to where they work or who they work for.
Okay.
So to us, this idea of, hey, people are verbally identifying with the profession before they verbally identify with their employee and organization might mean something.
Sure.
So that's kind of where that came from an anecdotal standpoint. And we really just wanted to see what that looked like in comparison to the construct.
I like it. I don't, obviously we want people to go read your paper, but also give them the clip notes of it. So when we're talking about the organization, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit off air and some other things that could potentially look at down the line, they show more positive work-related traits when they feel like they have control. Did you get a sense at all, and I don't remember specifically, like, did that vary from setting to setting at all? Is that something that you're going to look at in the future? We, again, talking off air, and this is a big thing, and I'm sorry that this is for everybody listening, that this has come up on a bunch of the relative podcasts, though you work with versus for concept, especially in the traditional setting with coaches and some of those other things, and where that kind of falls in your level of having this ownership or control.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. And that also kind of gets to the root of where our intentions were behind this study. Other conversations we had in the development process were the idea of kind of serving two masters. So you've used the word traditional, I'll say secondary school. In the secondary school setting, a lot of times athletic trainers are contracted by a healthcare institution or organization to work for a secondary school.
Sure.
So in that standpoint, they now have two different entities that they answer to. And part of our intention was looking at, how does that affect what they own, so to speak. So we actually didn't find any differences between organizational settings or job settings. Really, the major demographics we found differences between were years of experience and then supervisor status. So people who were in a supervisory role at the time of this study demonstrated higher levels of psychological ownership than those who weren't. And then people, I guess the age grouping that demonstrated the highest level of psychological ownership was athletic trainers who have been practicing for 21 plus years.
Okay.
So not age grouping, sorry, years of experience grouping.
Sure.
And then another interesting finding related to the demographics was that athletic trainers with 6 to 10 years of experience actually demonstrated the lowest. And I think there is some really interesting implications there. We didn't necessarily dive into them in the actual data collection process, but we did make some inferences in the discussion about previous literature that's shown that athletic trainers around the age of 30 tend to start leaving the profession. It's a pretty common trend. And that would potentially correlate with that 6 to 10 years of experience range for some athletic trainers. So there is potential for future research or even some conjecture that could be had about athletic trainers in that years of experience grouping, maybe experiencing less psychological ownership, and that being the reason they're deciding to leave either the profession or their organization.
Hearing that and just kind of the data you said, and this is obviously asking your opinion because you did the research, like for people that are in supervisory roles, having more psychological ownership, potentially then having a bunch of these 6 to 10 year out, 26 to 30-year-old or so people that are maybe leaving, it seems like a relatively easy connection of the dots. Not that the process would be easy, but that's something maybe those people in those supervisory roles really need to pay attention to, is what can you do to help facilitate that ownership with that group in hopes that obviously that keeps them in the profession.
Yeah, absolutely. And if whoever's listening gets a chance to read the paper, that's what the majority of the recommendation section within the discussion is based on, is kind of how to facilitate and develop ownership within all of your staff, really. But there is some things that we make specific mention to related to that 6 to 10 years of experience grouping. But yeah, for those supervisors, we kind of believe that part of the reason they're experiencing more ownership is because they have more decision-making power.
Sure.
So therefore they have more control. So really I'm going to say easy thing. I know it's not easy, but one step supervisors can make is, or organizations in general can make is closing that decision-making gap and providing more power to those that work beneath them, so to speak, those they supervise, and giving them a little bit more responsibility and control over specific situations.
I think that makes a ton of sense, and it's one of those, like, it's almost like you knew it, but then sometimes it's just nice to see it actually come out in some backed up, research wise. Now the profession side of it, I think is also really interesting, is if you are on social media at all, every now and again things get a little flared up about, what is the association doing, or now with the CPC recommendations and that coming through, there's a lot of maybe confusion and just opinion on what should be happening with it. So what did you guys find when it came to the broader profession, which seemingly is a much, much bigger question, obviously, but also an important one because, it is an association run by athletic trainers, obviously funded by athletic trainers.
Yeah. So I think one thing we were very cautious of when developing the tool initially was delineating between the profession and our professional association.
Okay.
I think a lot of times people connect those two.
Sure.
So they're ubiquitous entities, so to speak. But the profession itself is, I won't say more, but it is different than the association.
Right.
So we are very clear in our language to describe the profession as kind of the things that we do.
Sure.
So our domains, our descriptions, things like that. Just so there wasn't that confusion. Because I think, like you said, people do tend to get flared up about different things related to those entities. And we wanted to make sure that those feelings weren't affecting what we were measuring, so to speak.
Right.
But yeah, in relation to the profession, we found a few things, and we compared the profession to organizations, we compared ownership over the profession to ownership over employing organizations. And what we found is that people tend to have more ownership over the profession, the athletic training profession, than they do over their employing organizations. And specifically, they have a greater sense of belongingness and a greater sense of identity with the profession than they do with their employing organizations. And on the opposite end, they have a greater sense of territoriality and accountability with their organization than they do with their profession. So I think the interesting thing there is essentially people feel more connected to the profession than they do the organizations they work within. And that could lead to a lot of positive, potentially service-related behaviors within the profession that may not be occurring within individual organizations.
Sure.
And on the flip side, that idea that they're experiencing higher levels of territoriality means that they may, or territoriality within their organization specifically, means that they may be participating in behaviors like knowledge withholding and things similar to that within their organization that they don't participate in at a professional level.
Okay.
So those are kind of the major themes we saw when we looked at profession versus organization. Is really just the idea that people feel more belongingness and they feel like they identify more with the profession than with their organizations, which when we go back to that conversation you and I had earlier in this discussion, I said ATs when they introduce themselves say, hey, I'm an athletic trainer and I work with blank. And that kind of justified some of the opinions we had prior to this development of this project.
Yeah, I guess I had never really thought about it, in how people say that. I'm not going to pay attention to it, obviously. You don't say I work for, Indiana State University, I'm a instructor, it's usually, or an athletic trainer, it's usually I'm an athletic trainer that works at, which now I'm going to very much be paying attention to when I talk to people, what they say, and just in terms of if that's providing any hints.
Right. And I think that's just a really small example of how this is being expressed. Like there are probably many other examples of how people are demonstrating they feel more ownership with the profession than with their organizations. But that's one that I, like you just said, I'm kind of key on when I talk to people now.
Yeah, absolutely. So just based out of this one, I know you talked about some of the recommendations already, but do you see some implications for the profession? And I know what you were looking at was kind of coming back to, athletic trainers identifying with the profession, which is obviously evolving. And, we talked about that a little bit on your last episode with your tactical athlete care and that kind of up and coming setting in and of itself. But kind of big picture, do you see how implications from kind of this specific study, but then also future research?
Yeah. So when we started developing this study, what we looked at initially was the work-life balance position statement. And we really looked at some of the recommendations that were made within that. And we wanted to provide another construct to frame those recommendations within. I think a lot of times we hear work-life balance and we hear burnout, and those things seem almost insurmountable.
Sure.
So the idea of PO can be used to kind of frame and target specific programs or initiatives within organizations or personally to improve those situations by improving job satisfaction and kind of feelings of control at work and things of that nature. So really, I think an overall implication is that some strategies that organizations or people might use to improve how their employees feel could be framed within this idea of psychological ownership. And we talk about this a little bit within the paper, but there are definitive ways or ideas for developing PO that are related to improving self-efficacy, improving belongingness, improving intimate knowledge of something. So the idea of like the more you know about something, the more PO you have of it.
Sure.
Or improving immediate control or investment of self is another really big one. So the more you invest yourself into, the more more psychological ownership you feel. So I think we provide a few recommendations within, but just to touch on some of those ideas quickly. One that we spend a lot of time with is onboarding and orientation.
Okay.
If you go through some of the literature in athletic training, it's been covered quite a bit, and specifically things that have been found to be really beneficial for people that are transitioning into a new job or transitioning into the profession. So we kind of make specific framing references based on what's been found before. So there are certain aspects related to onboarding that would help athletic trainers invest themselves into an organization, that would help increase intimate knowledge of an organization, which then in turn would promote psychological ownership. The other thing is, I think a lot of times we tend to orient and onboard when people are new somewhere, but really that process can be continued across the work lifespan to continually check in and re-promote and redevelop that ownership so that people still feel connected to what they do. I think some other recommendations we make are related to self-care, which I think we're going to talk about some self-care later from my end, but self-care has been found to be, what's the word I'm looking for? It's been found to counter some of the feelings of burnout and work-life balance and job strain issues in the past. So again, we just frame some of that self-care within an organizational standpoint. So organizations have the power to provide some employee benefits and that's been seen in other healthcare entities and institutions throughout the country, but it's not, to our knowledge, something that's being done regularly in athletic training. So organizational leaders that supervise athletic trainers, potentially implementing things like moderate exercise or counseling services or other self-care strategies, but framing them within the organization. So if you work for X organization, you would go see a counselor within X organization.
Yep.
That kind of thing. Because really when it comes down to it, this idea of PO is, and I don't think this is mentioned anywhere in the paper, or this is probably just conjecture on my part, but the idea of PO has a lot to do with presence. So like where your feet are is where you're gonna feel like your feet are. So really anytime you can create that presence is gonna be beneficial.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Where do you see this potential research line going as you kind of continue to investigate this?
It's a really good question, and I'm sure my faculty advisors would love a specific answer on that as well. But I think in my head, I have two kind of different ideas related to this. The first is looking at this within like a practice-based or quality improvement framework and actually applying this idea somewhere.
Yep.
So measuring psychological ownership within a specific organization, applying a specific intervention to improve it,
right,
and tracking that over time. I think practical solutions are something that is needed not just in athletic training but in healthcare in general. And so actually going about doing those things is something that I'm interested in doing. So that's one potential avenue. Also, over kind of the development of this project and since it's been a little bit of time since I've submitted it for review and stuff like that, really come to realize that psychological ownership related specifically to work and profession is really, it's just a small piece of the pie.
Sure.
And there's a lot of other mediating factors that affect how people feel and how they operate in their life and then in work as a small part of their life. So I don't know what that research line looks like, but I'd like to look at the experiences of athletic trainers and other healthcare providers outside of work and kind of see essentially what that is, explore it, and then potentially down the line connect it to some other things that we see related to professional retention, job retention, things like that.
That sounds awesome. Anything we didn't cover around psychological ownership? We covered quite a bit in a short time span there, but I definitely don't want to leave anything out.
I think we covered everything that I had in my notes, at least, to cover. If anybody missed anything, feel free to check out the paper. I think it's got some more depth on this topic, so you can start there, or always reach out to me and I'll answer whatever questions too.
We'll link, for those listening, we'll link the paper up onto this page for it and have it in the notes, so you should be able to get to it. We'll just steal that link that got shared out originally until we see the full version officially live. So typically we ask the athletic training chat questions, which I think we answered the one that I was going to ask you with a little revision, but the other ones we had just asked you recently. But we added a new one since then. So we did want to ask, and you kind of alluded to, is as an AT in your role, how do you take care of yourself?
So I am very new to this role. So my answer is probably adapting by the day. But what I have in this role that I maybe haven't had in previous roles is a lot of flexibility with my time and my schedule. The DAT itself is an online program, so I'm afforded more freedom when it comes to how I operate. So because of that, I think the way I have at least found I need to take care of myself and working towards is really being strict about how I schedule my time and how I protect that time. I think yeah, the more flexibility you have, the easier it is to lose track of things. So that's kind of how I've had dedicated self-care, is really scheduling and planning and becoming a bit more task oriented so that I don't lose track of things, which in turn might cause stress or
For sure.
other issues. So that's where I'm at today. If you ask me this question in like 6 months, I don't know what I'd tell you, but
I can understand that. I think that's been the biggest thing for me, is that flexibility piece has changed. Just going from the collegiate setting where, yes, there was some obviously very scheduled things, but there was some variation in your day, to clinic where you are go from beginning to end. And so that's made it unique for scheduling purposes for myself. So I understand that one.
Yeah.
So like I said, we'll link up to this and also copy over some contact information, but just so you stated, if people wanted to get a hold of you or connect with you on this topic or anything else as you're getting going, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So the easiest way is probably on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @JustinY_ATC. I'm like 90% sure that's what it is. So
we'll double check that, make sure it's linked up so people can find it if they're looking up. So, well, I appreciate you taking the time and being adaptable and your flexibility, even though mine wasn't, to get on this call. So I appreciate that, and really do look forward to seeing where more of this comes out from you and from Indiana State, and how it can have an impact on the profession.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate chatting with you as always. And if you ever want to chat again, just holler.
Absolutely.